All right, thanks for that kind welcome. As you can see from the front slide here, Zach and I are both members of Meta's Privacy Red team. If this is a collection of strings you've never seen in quite that order before, I highly encourage you to check out Scott Tenalia's talk from Black Hat last year, which sort of lays the blueprint of how we approach privacy red teaming. It's not going to be sort of a central aspect of this talk, but just sort of in brief, what we end up doing is attacking from an adversarial perspective, where our main goal is to get user data. So that's sort of influencing why we ended up making these taxonomies, but just a little bit of background. Just a little level setting for folks here. Our main goal in presenting this talk is to talk about some of the design decisions that went into these taxonomies, or a little bit of a reflection on the use cases that we have internal to Meta, which hopefully generalize to you all. And then also to sort of serve as a jumping off point. Really, what we'd like to get out of this presentation is sort of a galvanization in the open source community for pursuing understanding these kinds of adversaries better. What this talk is not, is it's not a product or service pitch. We don't get any financial remuneration if you decide to use our frameworks. We're also not a standards organization. We're sort of throwing this out, hopefully to be useful to you all. And we're going to mention some aspects of cybersecurity frameworks that we ended up sort of augmenting or changing. But this shouldn't be read as like a takedown or criticism of those frameworks. In fact, you'll see we're actually big fans of some of those frameworks and incorporate some ideas from those frameworks in ours. And then finally, maybe I've sort of said this multiple times at this point, but it's not about absolutes. So we're going to present sort of how we did it, how we approach the problem, what's working for us. But if you take a look at the GitHub repos we're going to mention today, and you say, this doesn't really work for me or my organization, we'd really love to hear, how you tackle these same problems, because I think sort of collectively as a community, that's how we all sort of up-level. OK, so setting up the sort of roadmap for this talk, I'm going to introduce offensive privacy threats, sort of how we understand them, and how they're currently being tracked. That's going to sort of influence the next two things we're going to talk about, which are two taxonomies that we made internal at Meta. The first one we call the Privacy Adversarial Framework, or PAF. This is a TTP framework, very similar to MITRE's attack framework. And then Zach's going to talk about the meta weaknesses of enumeration, or MWE, which is an enumeration of weaknesses and their root causes. And then finally, we'll end with some key takeaways from sort of our journey in creating these taxonomies. OK, so sort of the central problem that we're trying to do is understand privacy adversaries. And really, sort of at its most basic level, you're asking yourself two basic questions. One, what data do you have? And that's going to vary pretty wildly depending on what industry you're in. Right? If you're in the health industry or financial industry, the data that you have and sort of your responsibility for protecting that data looks very different than, for instance, if you're a social media company or in defense or government work. And then the second question you need to ask is, who wants that data? And for some of these adversaries, there's heavy overlap with cybersecurity adversaries. So for instance, data brokers or nation state actors are pretty likely to launch zero-day or end-day attacks against your servers, try to breach your network in order to get at the data that you have. But a number of these adversaries are going to approach the problem of accessing your data in a quite different way than sort of a traditional cybersecurity adversary. Private investigation firms, stalkers, advertising agencies, or political campaign firms probably aren't hacking your servers, but they're going to try to extract data from your platform in sort of other more traditional ways. So we really want to understand these folks and what they do and how they interact with our platform. And there's sort of two key things that we really want to understand. The first is what's their behaviors, right? Their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, procedures. How do they interact with our platform? And in the cybersecurity world, probably the sort of dominant taxonomy for this purpose is MITRE attack. And then the second thing we want to understand is more on the attack surface side. How are they exploiting our platform? What weaknesses are they leveraging? And what are the root causes of those weaknesses? So in the security world, you might have CVE or CAPEC as a framework that you'd use to understand those things. And really sort of these two aspects are really important for us to truly understand not only what they're doing, but then ultimately how to remediate those actions on platform. So why not just take these great existing cybersecurity frameworks and just add in some privacy-specific tactics or vulnerabilities and sort of call it a day? Well, when we approached using these frameworks for this purpose, we ended up with sort of two main friction points. The first one was that privacy-centric tactics or vulnerabilities simply weren't present. These frameworks were designed for cybersecurity context, so it's not surprising that common issues that we run into in the privacy space might not be represented. And then the other thing that we'd run into is maybe technically they were represented by those taxonomies, but not at the level of granularity that was really helpful for us. So I'll go into three examples here. So a tactic that came up in the news this year is, you've got an adversary who's downloading data from some legacy endpoint via an Internet Archive site. This is currently difficult to express in MITRE's enterprise attack. There's a technique for searching open websites and domains, which is technically accurate. But when you think about what pathways you might have to mitigate this issue, it's not particularly helpful to look at it at that level of granularity. Similarly, if we look at sort of the vulnerability space, you may surface back user data on your platform in some way that you believe to be anonymized. But through either some side channel or pairing with open source data or some other mechanism, your adversaries are able to de-anonymize the data. Right? This is a pretty significant privacy issue, a very technical one. But we don't really have a great way for describing it in sort of cybersecurity frameworks. And yet another third example, contact point exposure. This is a pretty serious issue considered a privacy breach. One of the sort of central issues with Twitter's FTC order, right? If you're able to typically through an account recovery flow associate an identifier like an email address or a phone number to an account, you're essentially doxing that person unintentionally. And this is, again, a very serious issue on social media platforms, for instance. If you're a dissident or some other person who's trying to act anonymously and you're able to be doxed through this mechanism, it can have severe consequences. And if we look at the cybersecurity frameworks, again, there's technically categories that cover this. So for instance, CWE 200, exposure of sensitive information to an unauthorized actor. That's accurate, but it kind of sums up all of offensive privacy as well. So not exactly great for us to really understand things through this lens. So for these reasons, privacy threat intelligence lags quite a bit behind security threat intelligence. There's typically less open reporting than in security. It's very easy to ship off, hey, here's some technical weakness that we encountered, and sort of not have it be tied to your specific setup and infrastructure. And then even when you do have reporting on privacy threats, typically technical root causes or weaknesses aren't necessarily identified in that reporting. And as a result, common adversary tactics we see sort of pop up again and again and again, and the lack of tracking between these cases leads to them sort of reappearing frequently. So for these reasons, we decided to create our own. So the two we're going to talk about today are the privacy adversarial framework, which as I mentioned earlier is the TTP framework, and the meta weaknesses enumeration, which is enumeration of weaknesses. And what I want to sort of harp on in this talk is sort of key design decisions that you have to decide on when you're approaching creating one of these taxonomies. The first one is a pretty simple mechanics, input-output, right? Who's going to produce tagging data for you, and then who's going to consume that data and derive insights from that data. And then the second one is an interesting point. Do you want your framework to be privacy exclusive in the sense that you want it to only focus on privacy adversaries or privacy weaknesses? Or do you want it to be privacy inclusive and sort of bring the privacy side, the security side, and possibly the integrity side under a single sort of umbrella? And I think this is an interesting decision because we actually took opposite approaches for these two frameworks. All right, so next I'm going to talk about the privacy adversarial framework, or PAF. So this is a TTP framework heavily inspired by MITRE attack. And this slide is slightly inaccurate. We are not planning for public release. Public release went live on GitHub earlier this morning. We've got a link at the end of the talk. But we're releasing the tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques for this framework. And for this framework, we decided to be privacy exclusive And the idea is that it would supplement some existing cybersecurity framework, such as MITRE ATT&CK. In the public release, you can check it out, but we also included integration for MITRE's attack navigator, because we believe probably most people are using that for looking at adversary TTPs, even though that's not actually how we end up using things internally. If you've ever worked at MITRE or sort of seen our tech stack, it's all custom code from the ground up. Okay, so some of the design decisions that we had here. So why did we decide for PAF to make it privacy exclusive? And there were two main reasons. The first one is that when we tried to approach sort of merging privacy-specific tactics into existing cybersecurity frameworks, you had this notion of the kill chain. And something that we observed for privacy threat actors is they were quite opportunistic, and they didn't always make use of sort of steps in a kill chain. So your average stalker isn't setting up infrastructure. They're not doing really meaningful reconnaissance of your platform. They're not going to be monetizing their results or doing post-processing. That's super meaningful. There's no such thing as lateral movement, right? So for us, when we were understanding sort of how to do tagging, we really wanted to be sort of divorced from a kill chain. And then the second thing that led to this decision was that when we found overlap with cybersecurity frameworks, we didn't have the level of granularity that we needed to express some common issues. So for instance, spoofing is covered under MITRE ATT&CK's enterprise framework, but for us, spoofing user agents was a specific enough tactic that had direct impacts to detection, mitigation, and enforcement that we really wanted it spun off on as its own thing. So again, simple mechanics. How do you use this thing? For us, we have three main sources for tagging data. The red team, so when we do operations and have findings, we'll capture the tactics that we used and put those into our database. But we also have threat intelligence who are tracking bad actors, and investigations who are checking through cases provide tagging as well. On the data consumer side, all three of those groups act as consumers. For us on the red team, if we want to emulate some adversary action, we can use past tagging data to sort of understand what TTPs we want to replicate. Similarly, for threat intelligence and investigations, they may be looking for patterns of abuse. But some of the long-term benefits for this kind of tagging comes from insights and detections that you gain when you have the data in aggregate, right? If you want to understand where to make investments for defensive mitigations, right, this is what you really are looking for. And then finally at Meta, we have this concept of a purple team, which is kind of cool, which is they reinvestigate areas where there was prior abuse and some mitigations were put into place. So they'll go back and sort of replay adversary tactics against these new mitigations. So here's a screenshot of it, of the full framework within Attack Navigator. We do have top-level tactics just for visual clarity, but we're divorced from sort of the notion of the kill chain in that you can have sort of tags sparsely through here. We also have certain techniques that fall under multiple tactics, just because that was sort of helpful for us when we were structuring it. But there's, I think, 180 techniques and sub-techniques represented in the taxonomy. So let's run through a couple of examples on how you might use this. Pretty simple one. Let's take that example that just happened to be on the slide earlier. An adversary downloads data from a legacy endpoint via an internet archive. I know it's cherry-picked, it's on the slides, but yes, we have a tag for that. So under tactics, the adversary is accessing data. Under techniques, they're abusing some cache data. And then under sub-techniques, they're doing this via an archive site. So we have a way to tag this adversary behavior so that we can really keep track of how often this is happening and look at remediations for this particular behavior. All right, now let's look at a more involved example. And I'm kind of going to let the framework speak for itself a bit here. So we've got three different tactics that we observe: establishing infrastructure, detection and invasion enforcement, and data access. And across those, we are observing adversaries creating accounts using an official SDK, spoofing user agents. They're doing logged in actions, scraping using an open source tool, and they're doing some sort of access token abuse. Okay, so we have a pretty compressed view here of what that adversary action is. And just to clarify, this is like not dummy example. This is a real actor. But if we look at this action, we can already make some very quick decisions. So on the detection side, right, they're spoofing user agents and they're doing some sort of access token abuse. So are those indicators that we can use to rapidly detect historical abuse, right? Maybe they're using hard-coded user agents. So that's something we can do immediately on the detection side. Let's think more on the mitigation side for this actor. We could shift really far left here and say, we could play whack-a-mole on sort of all these like more technical issues on exactly what they were scraping and all those other things. But the first thing that they did was try to create a bunch of fake accounts. So let's make that more difficult for them. Let's make checkpoints for account creation. Let's scrutinize new accounts coming from cloud IPs or other things that are likely to be adversarial, right? So that's one way that you can address a lot of these issues sort of at an early stage. And then in later stages, right, you might look at how exactly they're scraping using this open source tool. Maybe there's some secrets in there that you maybe didn't realize about your API. You know that they're scraping from a logged in perspective. So whatever data they were after was valuable enough that we didn't make it accessible via logged out endpoints. Maybe logged in is not stringent enough. Maybe we need to put whatever data they're accessing behind some more severe restrictions. So some privacy setting for their profile, or potentially only for close connections like friends or followers. And then finally, there's some good research questions here. What kind of access token abuse were they doing, right? There's some deep technical thing there. And then also looking at their open source tooling, are there some secrets in how they're doing scraping that you can sort of think about for long-term mitigations for how you do rate limiting, et cetera. So hopefully, this sort of in-depth example has convinced you that there are some nice things that come out of using PAF. The key things that we see are you're able to identify common adversarial behaviors. So in one instance, we got sort of ideas on detection mitigation, but then hopefully in aggregate, you start to see patterns emerging for how adversaries are interacting with your platform. You can link those behaviors to common products and services, right? Is your mobile app how most of your adversaries are interacting with you? Is it your web platform? Figuring out where your weak links are so that you can make that defensive investment. Or if you're a red teamer, what you should be hacking next. Identifying emerging behaviors as they manifest, right? This is a common question that we have is we have a finding, and the first question is, well, how systemic is this, right? And you can really, unless you're capturing this information in some taxonomy, you're going to miss those sort of big questions. And then, once you've got all of this together, you're going to be able to identify certain choke points that you can, rather than playing whack-a-mole on every sort of case that you're running into, you can find the areas where those defensive investments really pay off for detection, mitigation, and enforcement. And then once you've done all of this, you'll have some rudimentary privacy threat intel feed within your org, and hopefully with the open sourcing within other orgs as well. OK, and with that, I'll hand it over to Zach, who will talk about MWE.
All right, thanks, David. So now we've discussed a little bit just privacy threats generally, as well as how we can go about tracking them, and talked a little bit more about how PAF can work to help track their TTPs. But diving in a little bit deeper and exploring the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that they exploit, and how we track that with MWE. So when we set out to build a privacy red team, one of the things that we set out to answer was, what are our privacy vulnerabilities, and what weaknesses are our adversaries leveraging in abusing privacy weaknesses? So as we explored this, we set out and looked at past incidents in security and privacy, and root caused these incidents down to the vulnerability level to see what the core technical weaknesses were that were abused. And somewhat unsurprisingly, we identified a number of commonalities between security incidents and privacy incidents around what the vulnerabilities were that were exploited. Of course, there were exceptions. Not everything was shared between privacy and security. But we did see a large set of overlap. And as intuitive as it sounds, our adversaries are very outcome-driven. Generally speaking, we find that they take the path of least resistance in attempting to carry out their objectives. So as an example of this, if an adversary is attempting to obtain the email address associated with some account on the platform, they generally don't care if they need to abuse SQL injection or a traditional security vulnerability to get this, or if something like the side channel in a response to some web request can allow them to infer that information. So as a result of that, we see this overlap. And at Meta especially, data is our adversary's main target, and we see a lot of this intersection of privacy and security in our adversary's behavior. So in order to address this, we set out with the MWE, or meta weakness enumeration, which was inspired by a number of the systems that David referenced earlier. MITRE's CWE and CAPEC systems were very useful in informing our design decisions here. As he mentioned earlier, we designed this to be privacy inclusive, which we'll touch on in a bit, in contrast to the decisions that were made with PAF. And additionally, one unique decision that we made with MWE is we made this unique to Meta. As David referenced with Attack Navigator, much of the underlying tech that we have is custom and unique to Meta. And as a result, we wanted to track some of the specific weaknesses and trends that we identified as pain points within our security and privacy and be able to track them with this system. So the first point I want to touch on to drill down a little bit more in our design decisions here is how we arrived at privacy inclusive. As I mentioned, the vulnerabilities that we saw encountered by privacy, security, and integrity teams often overlap. And additionally, the approaches towards detecting, preventing, and remediating those vulnerabilities are often the same. So when we thought about what our goals were for this taxonomy, we came up with the following. We wanted to enable more efficient tracking of vulnerabilities regardless of where they manifest themselves. So that is, if a team in security and a team in privacy and a team in integrity are all dealing with the same problem where a particular class of vulnerability is problematic for what their use case is, we want them to be able to track this cross-organization and be able to align around a solution that can work to improve the outcomes for everyone. Additionally, we wanted to be able to improve the education around vulnerabilities at Meta. We encountered a number of situations as we stood up the Privacy Red team where very strong privacy engineers may be unfamiliar with some classes of security vulnerabilities, and vice versa, where security engineers may not be as familiar with the privacy vulnerabilities that we encounter. And one goal and hope that we had with building a privacy-inclusive taxonomy was that by providing this single source of truth for the classes of vulnerability data that we're tracking, we can expose and educate engineers across the company around all of the types of vulnerabilities to be aware of, and hopefully make them better equipped to identify these issues where they've manifested themselves and also prevent them from occurring in the first place. So with privacy-inclusive decision in mind, we also took a look at who we actually expect to use this, as the end stakeholders and users here are going to inform a lot of the decisions we make about what specific types go into our taxonomy. So in addition to the security, integrity, and privacy groups that I've already touched on, at Meta we have a variety of other sources of vulnerability data as well. We have numerous systems and automated tooling, some of which are open source, to detect vulnerabilities via static and dynamic analysis. We have an extremely active bug bounty program, as well as external pen testers that we contract to identify vulnerabilities in some of our products. All of these are sources of vulnerability data that have MWE applied to categorize the vulnerabilities. On the other side, we also have a variety of consumers of this data as well. Now, I simplified this a great deal for the sake of this diagram, but we also have a variety of vulnerability management processes to track and mitigate the core vulnerabilities, as well as identify trends and hotspots that need attention. Similarly, we also have incident management for instances where we may identify someone attempting to actually abuse these vulnerabilities and ensuring that we adequately respond to those. All of these teams and processes are going to need to be able to adequately wield this taxonomy for their purposes and make sure that it meets their particular use cases as well. But to get a bit more specific here, in developing a taxonomy, a very important thing for us to identify was what the particular role would be of the people that are actually applying and consuming the MWE data and the vulnerability metadata generally. Would this be software security or privacy engineers that are generally pretty intimately familiar with software and the systems? Would it be project managers or some similar role, or even some other role entirely? And we looked at what Meta has done in the past, and there have been a variety of different solutions and approaches that have been taken. And what we found was somewhat unsurprising in that the further you got away from the engineers, the software and security engineers, you saw a lack of, or a reduced data quality when it came to the highly technical vulnerability classes. And as a result, we decided for Meta that we wanted to be able to track at that deep technical level and even updated a variety of our processes to ensure that every vulnerability that is tracked at the company either has the vulnerability category applied by an engineer or has the MWE type applied to it validated by one of our engineers. Now, we understand that what is the right decision for Meta may not be the right decision for your organizations, but by selecting engineers as the target that we believed would be applying these types, we were able to go with a more technically focused taxonomy. And if the selection that is right for your organization is different, then consider adjusting the level of technical specificity to meet the user who would actually be wielding the taxonomies. So with now the privacy inclusive nature and the stakeholders identified, let's touch a little bit on what specifically we are aiming to measure with MWE. So for MWE, we actually broke this out into two subtaxonomies. We call them vectors and root weaknesses. So vectors is essentially the method of abuse. What was the initial action that was taken that caused some violation to occur? And then root weaknesses is drilling down at the underlying technical cause that enabled that vector to exist. So if you're familiar with the MITRE frameworks that were mentioned previously, root weaknesses is most similar to MITRE's CWE, while vectors is most similar to the MITRE CAPEC framework. To drill into the example that we've presented previously of contact point exposure would be the vector at play here, where the root weakness would be a response side channel, where something in the response, maybe via a password or account reset, differs and allows an attacker to infer the association of an email address to some account. So in summary of the MWE design, we wanted this to be a privacy-inclusive system that's applicable to teams across the company, and for this taxonomy to be a unified source of truth for anyone tracking vulnerability data within the company. Additionally, we decided to make this a technically focused system to be primarily used by our engineers, and we wanted to identify cross-organizational trends, allow us to inform tech investment, and also spread awareness and educate our workforce better around the vulnerability classes that we face. And additionally, we wanted this to categorize both the vectors of abuse that we see, as well as the technical weaknesses that enable them to occur. So MWE was somewhat recently rolled out across Meta, but in the short time, and which is probably about 3 or 4 months that this has been the primary taxonomy that has been used, we've already seen educational efforts around privacy-centric vulnerabilities spring up at the company. We've also identified cross-organizational collaborative efforts and working groups spring up around shared issues where groups across privacy and security and integrity have all had shared issues that they've identified through the system. And something that we didn't initially expect that we actually were very pleased to see come out of this were efficiency gains. We identified that by aligning the company and organizations on a single source of truth for vulnerability categorization, that we were able to eliminate some redundant categorization where different groups across the company were relying on different taxonomies, and as a result, redundantly categorizing vulnerabilities such that each group had their particular taxonomy categorized on some shared vulnerability. So Black Hat's winding down now, and everyone here can go back to their companies and organizations and ask, now, I heard all about these taxonomies that Meta built. What does that mean for me, and what can I bring back to my organization? Well, I'm glad you asked. The first thing that we'd recommend is investigating the privacy threats that are unique to your product and organization. Using the questions that David presented earlier about what data I have and who primarily do we think wants it is a good starting point there. Additionally, consider the privacy inclusive and privacy exclusive approaches that we laid out here and how that informed our design decisions, and use that process to decide which of those approaches make sense for you and your company. More specifically, explore the privacy attack framework and the MITRE attack navigator integration, and explore how that can augment your capabilities in tracking the TTPs of the adversaries that you face. And finally, also explore how the MWE design decisions may impact your vulnerability management programs and whether or not it makes sense to expand your views of vulnerabilities to include these more privacy-centric classes that are not historically included in vulnerability management programs and frameworks. And thank you so much. Also, we'd like to continue this conversation. We have our contact information up here as well as our GitHub link. I think we have time to take a couple questions here and also continue the conversation in the wrap room after we run out of time here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So most of the tools, security tools, when they provide vulnerabilities, they also provide these categorizations like CWE and OWASP. So how does this work with that existing categorization? Do we have to put another layer to do this categorization, or you are like integrating with the existing tool somehow?
So for PAF specifically, the integration with MITRE attack that we have on our GitHub page is a separate layer. So you'd use it just like, MITRE attack has like the enterprise, the mobile, and the ICS layers. It would just be a separate layer. And we have instructions in the GitHub to how to augment that within MITRE attack.
Okay. And just one more question. So since you applied this framework, can you name one biggest change that you've seen in the organization? Like, what is the biggest gain that you have seen so far?
The biggest gain, I think, is in understanding which problems are systemic versus one-off. So, we were tracking, of course, all of these things before, as they were happening. But the big question from leadership to us is always, is this a one-off incident, or is this a systemic thing that requires deeper investment? So I would say for PAF, that's sort of the big takeaway. Do you have an answer for MWE?
I think with MWE, the biggest gain that we have seen is really the organic collaborative efforts that we've seen spring up that around problems that we've faced historically, but have been primarily owned by a single organization.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you were next.
You talk a lot about vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. Typical traditional vulnerability management is not something that we focus very much on privacy. I'm curious how you've been able to kind of tack that on with existing vulnerability management teams, right? We focus on systems and weaknesses in code mostly. And this primarily seems like it's more focused on some of the data that is being protected on the systems that we normally find vulnerabilities on. So how has then this been tacked onto that?
Yeah, so one of the design decisions that we made that I believe probably made our integration with our existing vulnerability management processes possible was our technical focus. I think generally speaking, and I know coming from a security background prior to my current role, I felt the same way, that when I would hear privacy vulnerability, I would generally think of not very technical failings. However, some of the specific types that we focused on are true technical failings here that are occurring at the software level. And by defining them and calling them out at a technical level, they actually were a closer fit to what the vulnerability management teams were actually familiar with dealing with and ensuring adequate resolution of, that it was a more organic fit for them than I at least initially anticipated it might be.
Okay, can I have a follow-up question? Yeah, so the detection of this with this new framework, is it going to aid these teams in that way to be able to come up with detections and things like that that can feed the vulnerability management team to be able to address these concerns, right? Because I think the last piece here is that you're already working with those teams to begin with to remediate existing system vulnerabilities, but now we're looking at it from privacy-specific vulnerabilities.
So I'll just address with like the TTP framework, right? You might not see these things crop up as like small technical problems that you can really identify, right? So I think there's value in bridging from, like, let's say in the example, right, account creation being a hurdle for adversaries, right? You're probably not going to see that manifest in some bugs, right? So those lines of communications need to be open for sure. But to Zach's point, there are a lot of things where you're looking at, how adversaries approach API abuse, right? Where there is a deep technical reasoning behind it. And you can remediate those things purely from like a weakness enumeration side.
And to add on to that a bit, through the integration with the vulnerability management, one of the benefits that we are actively working on is we're tracking which of our privacy vulnerabilities are potentially underrepresented in our automated detection systems, such as static analysis and things of that nature, and using that to inform investment into how we can more efficiently direct static analysis teams to hotspots and problematic areas within our code.
Thank you.
Question over here?
Very good work. I'm interested in another framework, which has to do more with the human abuse framework, tracking framework, and has nothing to do with the platform that you have, but it's more of an interest of ours to be able to define and develop that framework. And so I don't know if you have done any work in that arena.
So we have not, because we're sort of specifically under the remit of privacy, but there are, of course, a lot of integrity teams at Meta that are interested in, mitigating those kinds of issues.
Okay, thank you so much.
I guess you can say the best for last. All right. Hey, I see you had on there that who could use this methodology, right, this framework. I'm a threat modeler, right? So everybody's pretty much familiar with Stride, Dread, and so on. So the methodology we use is PASTA, the process of attack, simulation, threat analysis. And I was wondering, has anybody ever tried to use that methodology with PASTA or any kind of threat modeling?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of different groups within Meta that do threat modeling at various stages, for product development and things like that. Those groups, many of those groups end up using these frameworks as well, but I'm not super connected to which specific frameworks that they're using for doing their threat modeling.
I'm going to take a look at it.
What?
So my team is on 2 different frameworks and see how we could probably overlap that using PASTA.
Yeah.
So I can get your information and give you feedback.
All right.
Thank you.
Sweet. Okay, and we're officially out of time. We'll head to the wrap room if there's any more questions. Thanks, everybody.